the point of this whole thing, it's not so much about what we're facing. The most important thing is who are we facing it with?
Am I going through this good time or bad time with God, or am I trying to run on my own steam here? Because our steam runs out.
When I was at the pinnacle, I needed God. When I was at the bottom, I needed God.
Welcome back to Chat for Time. Today we're continuing our discussion on surrendered peace, and today we're going to be looking a little bit about how sometimes the storms in life maybe wrongfully rob us of our peace if we approach them incorrectly, and a couple of other areas, but storms being the main focus for today. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, a good chunk of our message on Sunday was from Mark chapter 4. The example of Jesus calming the storm, in the Sea of Galilee. It said that Jesus, he and the disciples been doing some ministry. He said, "Let's get on the boat, go to the other side," which I believe the disciples would have had foundational issues with to begin with. So I don't think that this was going to be a journey that they were real thrilled about to begin with. But then they get out on the sea, and this is a place that's between two mountains basically, and it's prone to pretty bad storms just out of nowhere. And there was a lot of superstitions with this sea that the devil was in the sea. So there was a history here of some inclement weather just coming out of the clear blue sky, so to speak. And this storm comes up, and the disciples are afraid for their lives. And one thing that that I mentioned that sometimes gets lost in a Sunday school lesson story is that there were lifetime seasoned fishermen on this boat that had spent their life on this sea.
Yeah, they knew what they were experiencing.
They've experienced some stuff out there. Whenever they were afraid for their lives, it was a bad storm.
Right.
So, this is not just a run-of-the-mill storm.
Yeah, totally.
But Jesus was asleep. They're afraid for their lives. So they go down, they wake him up, and he, peace, be still. He calms the storm. He challenges their faith after that. And we looked at this element, this story of the power that peace can have in our lives. And I made the statement, and it's not new to me. I've heard preachers say it time and time again over the years, is that they believe that that we find ourselves as believers in three phases of our life. We're in one of these at a constant state. Number one, we're either coming out of a storm or a difficult time in our life. Number two, we're in the midst of one. Or number three, we're heading into another one.
Right.
And there was a statement that we made at that point is like, that focus. What are we focused on in this time in our lives? We see Peter when he was walking on water, as long as he was focusing on Jesus, he was good. The moment that his focus went on to the circumstances and the elements, his faith began to wane and he began to sink. But the point of this whole thing to drive home was it's not so much about what we're facing. The most important thing is who are we facing it with? And that's, kind of these storms and trials and difficulties of our lives, and who are we focusing on in the midst of them? And
storms are one of those interesting things because they are entirely subjective.
Yes.
Like a big deal to one person might be an average Tuesday to another.
Exactly.
And that's always a hard thing. Like, we deal with I work with young people here at church, and, when a 14-year-old goes through a breakup, it is life-altering catastrophe. Like, they were together for a whole week, and it was like this disaster.
I remember that. It's pain, man.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the time, adults, we tend to look at that and be like, just wait till you're older.
Yeah.
Life gets harder. Yeah. And that's true. But for them, that's like the first major thing that they've ever experienced. So it's the hardest thing they've ever gone through. So each of us, I think we go through things in life, and at some point, almost every time you hit a storm, it's the hardest storm you've ever faced. So you don't want to make light of that.
Yeah.
Because it is a storm.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, it's like, whether it's your first breakup or you lose a child or something, absolute disaster happens. Like you said, who you're going through it with is important regardless of the scale of where you're at in these things. And I think sometimes we, unfortunately, we go through the little things like, well, I can handle that one. Don't worry about this one, God. I got this one.
Yep.
And that's not what he's wanting. You know, it's like we talked about last week with not last week, on Monday, about the Great Commission. I will be with you always. It's not like I'll be with you when times get really tough, but the rest of the time you can handle these things.
Right.
It's like, no, everything, you know, the big and the small, the good and the bad, whether you're just out of a storm, in the middle of a storm, peak of a mountain, bottom of a valley, who you're with is really important.
Yeah. Those promises that we need to cling on to. You know, like you said, I'm with you always. We talked about Monday that, you know, the Lord is near. We see in Hebrews, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. You know, there's these promises of proximity that we need to consistently remind ourselves of, and that whether things are the worst storm that we've ever faced, just a mild disturbance in our existence, or if we're living relatively peacefully in what we're going through, there has to be this recognition that God's always there.
Right.
Even if it is a good time, it's not just like he's like, okay, I want to go clock out, take a 15-minute break, and I'll be back. He's always there. And that, you know, we don't tend to long for him that much whenever times are peaceful. We're thankful for them. But as far as the longing, I know for my tendencies, it's not there as much as when the trials of life are really, really bearing down on me. Yeah. And, you know, that's the kind of moments that we really need to make sure that our focus is on him, and that we're focusing on his word, his presence, and understanding that, again, he's good. Ultimately, he's good. He knows far more than what we know. So he knows what's on the other side of that storm or that mountain or whatever that we're facing. He already knows what's on the other side of that, where we do not. Yeah.
There's maybe a whole other conversation for another time, but it is amazing how often we see comfort and everything being good. People get kind of lazy in their faith because you don't need God, with parentheses, right? Like, you know, in that moment, like in a sense, because like, well, I've got enough finances, I can look after myself, type of thing. And then bizarrely, when people lose a loved one, the amount of stories you hear of that bringing them back to God. Yeah. That seems so counterintuitive. Yeah. You know, I think our culture, we've got this lie that's been embedded of like, well, every blessing is godly and every disaster is from the enemy. Yeah. And it's like, well, not to say that God causes these disasters, but God uses them in ways that that comfort can actually be a real detriment. Again, not to say we should seek the storms, but we should be always hyper aware of like, okay, am I going through this good time or bad time with God, or am I trying to run on my own steam here? Because our steam runs out, you know.
Very easily, very quickly. Yeah. When, you know, and Paul said, you know, that I've been in plenty, I've been in want, I've known what it is to have much and been in need, you know, but you know, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Talking about that fluctuation that we can find ourselves in life is like, listen, when I was at the pinnacle, I needed God, you know, because I was doing all things. When I was at the bottom, I needed God. And I found out that at the pinnacle, at the bottom, everywhere in between, that is the constant in my life. And I found that I can do all things through him, whatever situation I'm in. Paul also writes in 2 Corinthians, he's talking about here the weakness of this body, of our life now, as opposed to the strength of the resurrected life and the resurrected body. And he pens this, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8, we are hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted, we're not abandoned. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. And I love that perspective of that reminder of like all of these things are coming against us, but that source is still there.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, any other thoughts on this one today? Or
just in the good and the bad, indifferent, keep your eyes on Jesus. And that's challenging. Cool. It's very challenging.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, we got one more installment, I guess, would be the word for surrendered peace. So make sure you come back and join us on Friday as we dive into that, and we'll see you then.